At REAMP's annual meeting in Chicago last June, there was a straw poll, and I do mean a real straw poll with straws. The purpose was to get the pulse of REAMP members as to where the 2018 annual meeting was going to be. And now it was nip and tuck. But with the help of some good friends from Ohio, North Dakota won the straw poll. And recently, the REAMP steering committee finalized that decision, so REAMP members will be gathering in Bismarck, North Dakota this coming June, and we're really excited about that. There's a lot of talk at REAMP about equity and about living what we value, and Mickey last time in Chicago, next year in Bismarck, is really the reason that happened was because the members of REAMP want to live our values, and we're really happy about that. Now, to introduce my good friend Melissa Gavin, who I said is the Chief Network Officer of REAMP. REAMP brings together over 175 nonprofits and foundations across 8 Midwestern states, from Ohio to North and South Dakota, on climate change and energy policy. Melissa's most recently served as the co-director of REAMP's organizing hub, and Melissa came to REAMP to start that organizing hub on helping the members there do a much better job of campaign excellence in the network. And it's paid off. There's some really good materials and workshops that we've done, and we're doing some really good work. Through her work, the hub has focused on helping climate advocates in the Midwest take thoughtful, systems-level approaches to campaigns through campaign planning and power analysis. And prior to coming to REAMP, Melissa served as the executive director of the State Environmental Leadership Program, or SEP, which was also a network of advocacy groups. She has a Master of Public Affairs degree with a focus on nonprofit management from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Florida International University in Miami, Florida. She lives in Madison, Wisconsin, with her husband and 4 children, garden, chickens, and beehives. I've known Melissa ever since I started as the director of Dakota Resource Council in 2012. Mark Treshock, my predecessor in this job, was so great in making sure that I knew important information. And I remember Mark told me, now, Don, Melissa Gavin is someone you are really going to want to meet soon. She is smart, intuitive, understands what we are all about. And she is one of the nicest, genuine, good person. So Mark, as usual, was right. And so please join me in giving a warm North Dakota welcome to Melissa Gavin.
Wow, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Microphone's good? Okay. Thank you, Don. Thank you, April. Thank you, all of you. I'm honored to be here today. I traveled here from southern Wisconsin to enjoy your wonderful Lutheran coffee. Thank you. And to talk about bringing power back to the people who are affected by decision makers who have, with increasing ease and hubris, shut us out of the places we deserve to be. So I want to talk about how the balance of power is tipped against us right now, about how we can fix that, what the research tells us about what we can do to fix that, and to tell you that what you're doing through your work with DRC is actually incredibly important. It's the surest way to restore power imbalances that are keeping us from the quality of life that we want. So I wanted to start my speech off with a story to illustrate the power of high-quality grassroots organizing to lay out what can happen when common people come together to fight injustices, how grassroots organizing and grassroots leaders have changed the world. And I wanted to draw from pop culture to lift up what a leader, what a hero looks like. And my research mostly consisted of Netflix binging over the last week. It was pretty entertaining. By the way, you might want to check out the show Good Place. But I came up empty-handed when I was trying to find stories of ordinary people making big change in popular TV and movies. Because here's what pop culture tells us that heroes, the people who bring about much needed change, look like. Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, Neo from The Matrix, that kid from The Neverending Story. I don't know who he is.
Atreyu.
Nice work, thanks, Nicole. Those characters, the heroes of so many ubiquitous stories in our culture, all have something in common. They've all been the chosen one. Their rise to glory was prophesied, and they, and only they, that one special individual, could bring justice and peace and power and balance back to the world. They, and maybe a small team of helpers, or maybe a horse, and they were the special ones. They were also young, male, white, able-bodied, and usually pretty good-looking. And the underlying message is that if you aren't visited by a giant in the middle of the night who tells you that you are the special one, that you probably aren't, and that you should probably wait for someone who is. So that old storyline is one we need to disrupt, because it's not true, and because the important work that needs to be done, we can't wait around for Keanu Reeves to show up. But if he does, could somebody let me know? Because I really want a picture. I mean, I'm not anti-Keanu Reeves. But we live in a culture that tells us that ordinary people like us, we can't take on the big guy. We're made to believe that we don't know enough, or we don't have the right to occupy the spaces of the people of power. We live in a culture that glorifies the chosen one as the truest or the best leader. We live in a culture where whoever has the most money has the most voice. Our movies and our TV shows and so much of pop culture tells us that heroes, whoever they are, should expect a dramatic start to their journey with stirring music along the way and a clear and final victory. And we're left with the impression that someone stronger, someone richer, someone braver, someone smarter or with more prominent pectoral muscles, or rousing theme music will bring balance to the world again. Listen, if that's true, they're asleep at the wheel. And we better get going. So I want to talk to you today about three things. First, go to the next slide for me. The balance of power is tipped against us right now. Right now. Second, that's fixable. And I want to talk about what the research says about how we build power and win. And finally, there is no one but us. Exactly what April said earlier. We are the heroes we've been hoping will restore balance to the universe. So who am I? Don has already introduced me, but I'll tell you again. And why am I standing in front of you? I'm Melissa Gavin. I work for the REAMP network. The REAMP network is focused on addressing climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050. And our unique approach to changing that is that we combine the strategy of taking a systemic approach, a systems analysis, with the power of working in collaboration with those organizations who know their communities best. The REAMP network is made up of over 180 nonprofits and foundations across the upper Midwest. Some of our members focus on policy advocacy, others work on with frontline communities, others work on building the political will that's necessary for climate action. and we're proud to call Dakota Resource Council a member of the REAMP network. Prior to serving as Chief Network Officer, as Don said, I developed and led the REAMP Organizing Hub, and we seek to boost campaign excellence in the REAMP network. I raise chickens, I raise honeybees, I raise babies, and I raise a movement to build the power of normal people to impact decisions that affect them. So as a member of Dakota Resource Council, I want you to know that you're part of something bigger. Your work is connected through REAMP to the work of 7 other Midwestern states, as well as groups all over the country. And folks are already watching you and learning from your work and the lessons that you've learned here in North Dakota, and they've rippled across the Midwest through the REAMP network. You're part of something bigger, and together, by transforming ourselves into the leaders that we need to be, and working with and learning from each other, we can shift the balance of power back in our favor. So there are 3 things you're going to hear from me today. So if you fall asleep, that's okay. Here are the 3 things you need to know, and when you wake up at the end, you won't have missed a thing. I want you to know 3 things from today. I want you to know that the balance of power is tipped against us. We feel that. We know that. We can fix that. That's fixable. And we need to fix that because there's no one but us. Nobody's going to give us our power back. Next slide, please, Nicole. So the balance of power is tipped against us. I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is this painful truth that power inequities are real, and they're creating real barriers to a safe and peaceful and thriving and sustainable world for all of us. The hard truth is that some people are more powerful than us. Some people are less powerful than us, and some people, even at times, are powerless. And our real work is actually not whatever the current issue of the day is that we're trying to address. Our real work is actually, because those issues are fluid. What I mean by that is issues come and go. They need our attention for sure. But our real work is to identify that power inequity, understand why it's there, and figure out how to take our power back. And that means taking a clear-eyed assessment of who has power, what that means, and then coming up with a plan to change the power dynamic, and doing that in community with others, as you're doing today. That's the only way we're going to address our most vexing problems. So in the REAMP network, we often talk about applying a systemic approach. What we mean by that is a systems analysis, a systemic approach to the complex problems, and for us, that means the complex problem of climate change. So complex problems like climate change and food insecurity and poverty, these things often require a systemic approach. There are multiple inputs, lots of interdependencies, and you need to better understand the system you're working in and how different parts of the system affect one another. But too often, when we think we're taking a systemic approach, we actually miss the mark because we underestimate how power inequities silence or shut down entire groups of people. How power inequities that are fed by our personal and our societal biases about race and class and gender and education level and affluence, they take the voice away from people who are affected by the decisions of the powerful. And that power dynamic, I often say, is sort of like the molten rock. Oops, there goes my tag. I'll just put it right here, so you know who I am. It's that molten rock that's guiding those tectonic plates that everything else is on. So unless and until we're talking about power inequities, we're not actually taking a systemic approach to anything. And our efforts to address our quality of life concerns are going to continue to be stymied and repeated over and over again until we're thinking about power and thinking about how to do it differently. So we're seeing the results of power inequities play out right now. As the Trump administration has come in and relaxed so many of our protections for our land and our air and our water, many of us around the country are fighting to keep the needed protections on the books to guard our health and our welfare. We see that here in North Dakota with your efforts on Fort Berthold to get and keep BLM rules now that the Trump administration's in power. And you're not alone. Membership in activist organizations, even the largest and the best known ones, are wielding less power and influence today. In the 1970s, North Dakota had the best reclamation law in the country. But as the Bakken Reserve was discovered, you had public officials who wanted to make sure that the industry made the decisions this time around. And they did. So what proceeded was huge development without any planning, rape and pillage of the land and its people. The power had changed hands. It became concentrated, became corrupt, and the conversations with those in power started to fall on deaf ears. So you talk about reducing flaring. You talk about radioactive oil waste landfills. You talk about the threat of pipeline infrastructure leaking and siting issues, limiting ranchers and farmers' use of their own land. And the conversations, like many of those that are happening across the region when it comes to bringing the concerns of the common citizen to decision makers, didn't make the change we need. And you've got big threats looming. A refinery that's being proposed next to Theodore Roosevelt National Park with its corporate power and all the influence it'll yield. Well, North Dakota is also a battleground for CAFOs, for concentrated animal feeding operations. So here again is the threat of a huge wave of power in the form of corporate farms. Your anti-corporate farming law is the strongest in the country, but there's an effort to make it unconstitutional. Thankfully, DRC was given intervener status, and you'll be sitting in the courtroom when that goes to trial. So the fight's still on, and it's time to move forward. So someone once said, and I put this in quotations, but I honestly don't know who said it, and if anybody does, please let me know, because I want to give them credit. Someone once said, there are only two questions human beings have fought over the course of human history. Those two questions are, how much do you love me? And who's in charge? Everything else is somehow manageable, but those two questions of love and control trip us up, cause war and grief and suffering. Now, when I first heard this, I dismissed it. I dismissed it as overly simplistic. But over the years, it's nagged at me. Because time and time again, I've observed human conflict and problems, and it's often boiled down to one or both of these questions. Who has power? Do I? Do you? Do I have agency? Self-determination? And how much do you love me? Am I connected to others? Am I in a community with others? Am I included? And it strikes me that through your work with DRC, you're doing both. You're addressing both of these. You're exposing and working to address the underlying power inequities that drive our most vexing problems, and you're doing it in community and building community among yourselves. So now I do want to tell a story. It's a story that you won't find in popular culture. Nobody's ever made an epic movie out of it, but it's a true story from our past. And this is a story about Frances Willard. Does anybody know who Frances Willard is? Mark, good. Okay, one person, so I'll tell the story about Frances Willard. Of course Mark knows. So Frances Willard is the woman who organized the temperance movement. I know, boo, hiss, yay, I don't know. But she did. And in the late 19th century, Frances Willard traveled all over, 30,000 miles a year on a train, visiting communities all over the country. And when people wanted to get involved in the temperance movement, she would say, first, take a personal pledge to swear off alcohol. So develop your own values and make a personal commitment. Second, she would say, join with others and shut down a bar. Now, she did that because she wanted people to have the experience of collective action and to realize that the power that people could have by working with others was more than what they could do by themselves. That had a transformational effect on people. They gained a huge sense of agency and understanding how they could make an impact. And they learned, hey, if I work with others, I can do things I can't do by myself. It was only after people had that experience were they then invited to join the national movement. I'm not interested in shutting down bars. And in fact, I've been advised to check out the speakeasy in Bismarck. That's probably the result of our friend, Miss Willard. But her approach is really the crux of shifting power back in our direction. If you want to understand how to build power and win, that comes from getting people involved in a way that transforms their own abilities. It comes from creating agency for individuals and then acting in community. So power inequities are real, and they're creating real barriers to a world that we want to live in. The balance of power is tipped against us right now, but you know what? It's fixable. So where does power come from? When we're talking about influencing public policy, we often say it comes from three sources. It comes from money, people, and information. Now I say those three things in one sentence, in one breath, as if they're all equal. And the truth is they're not. So information is important, but it's a laggard. It's way back here. You need to have it, but it's not the most compelling thing. It's not your biggest source of power. Of those three things, money and people, by far, are the biggest source of power. Now, we know we're never going to have the power that our opponents do. We're never going to have the money, that our opponents do. But that doesn't mean we won't have the power, because we have people, and people are powerful. So there's some interesting research out there by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen, who wrote a book called Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. They studied mass movements across the world over the past 100 years. And their research suggests that no mass movement failed after mobilizing and sustaining active participation of 3.5% of the population or more, coupled with a consenting majority. Further, they said that movements rely on nonviolent methods like strikes and boycotts and protests and demonstrations and sit-ins are far more likely to succeed than those that rely on street fighting and riots. That movements that are more likely to succeed when they remain resilient when repression escalates against them, and that movements that succeed tend to create divisions within some of the support pillars of a power holder, dislocating the power holder from their sources of power and support. So in North Dakota, 3.5%, to me, if I do the math right, looks like 26,528 people, active and sustained participants, along with a willing majority. That sounds like a lot. But first of all, we don't need that many behind us to make important improvements in our lives on the issues that we care about. And I'll talk about some of that research in a minute, but we do need more people to help us win. So how do we get there? How do we get to 26,000 activists? Well, here's what the research says about building power and wielding influence. And here's a spoiler. It looks a lot like what you're already doing and making it bigger. So there's an academic out of the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her name's Hari Han. And she's written a great book called How Organizations Develop Activists. She's really on the leading edge of researching and understanding how movements build power. To meet the challenges of building power, Han says, it's simply this. Civic associations need to go broad in their mobilizing and deep in their organizing. I want to pause here for a moment and explain the difference between organizing and mobilizing, because a lot of us say those words interchangeably, and there's an important distinction. True grassroots organizing is decentralized. It's focused on encouraging relationships and autonomous collective action and individual leadership development. Mobilizing is an approach that's more centralized, and it's focused on encouraging discrete transactional encounters with as many people as possible. So organizing is the deep and ongoing and necessarily time-intensive process of meeting people where they are, building relationships, empowering people to take actions that will bring about concrete improvements in their lives and the lives of others in their community. Mobilizing moves people quickly into action, but in a transactional way. It often lacks depth, but it can get broad and get many people to take action quickly. Now, the research on building power tells us we actually need to do both. We need to go broad in our mobilizing and deep in our organizing. But the fact is that most civic groups, most associations and organizations aren't doing that. They're concentrating efforts on things like online mobilizing efforts, where they can get as many voices heard as possible. And I tell you, we do that at our own peril. So lots of groups have figured out how to get hundreds or even thousands of online petition signatures in just a few days. Thanks, Liz. Thank you. But what we're learning about what influences decision makers and eventually changes the power dynamic is that focusing on amassing huge numbers of forum emails isn't likely to get at the systems level change that we need to make. So here's an example from the Analyst Institute. Is anybody familiar with the Analyst Institute? A little bit? Okay. So this is a group that conducts and collaborates empirical research from the field about what works in electoral and issue advocacy campaigns. And I thought this was interesting. There's research that shows that a low volume of emails can be effective in moving policymakers, with one study showing that just 3 emails from constituents was enough to increase the probability that a New Hampshire state Senate legislator would support a smoke-free workplace bill. There's other research by other researchers that suggest that a high volume can be perceived as inauthentic, and that lawmakers can disregard a large amount of emails, especially on contentious issues, because they feel that they're less trustworthy. So here's the thing. Lawmakers are human beings, and human beings are really good at sniffing out baloney. It's not that your opinion doesn't matter, it's that when it comes from another real human being who has a face and a story behind the issue, it becomes much more compelling. And that's why grassroots organizing is the key to building power. The behavior of elected officials really can change after learning about their constituents' opinions through public polling, through patch-through calls, and even through email. But it's particularly effective when the information is new and it's coming from real people. So how do we get real people involved? Here's what the research says. So research suggests that people participate when these kind of 4 things align: when they have the resources